The Australian Financial Review.
Hello, I'm James Thompson, Senior Chanticleer columnist at the AFR. Welcome to our weekly news breakdown of all things business, finance and markets. With me today, as always, is my Chanticleer colleague. He always provides the taxpayer with value for money. It's Anthony McDonald. How are you, Anthony?
Happy to be one of Australia's PAYG slaves, James.
Fantastic. This week we explain why the new work-from-home debate is hiding a bigger battle between bosses and workers. We ask why the government is using your money to buy shares in a struggling lithium miner, and go inside the fat-fingered moment that's got the financial market talking. All right, Anthony, let's start there. Now, mate, have you ever got the spelling wrong in a text message? Maybe a ducking hell, maybe? Or perhaps you've added an extra digit to a bank account or a credit card number? Well, spare a thought for some poor soul at the ASX Limited, the market operator, who had a shocker on Tuesday when they mixed up a private equity firm called TPG, which was buying an IT company, for a telecommunications business, which is also called TPG. And that company was minding its own sweet business. Now, when investors in the telco thought that they'd just bought a busted up IT business, they freaked out and they sold the stock down, wiping almost $400 million off its value in 15 minutes until the ASX wised up and stopped the rot. If this wasn't so serious, it'd actually be pretty funny, but it's not, because the ASX is already under huge pressure for some pretty silly errors, right?
Oh yeah, ASX is under massive pressure, James. In isolation, this is just a stuff up. You know, someone got their wires crossed. They got TPG Capital, the private equity firm, mixed up with TPG Telecom, which sells phone and internet services, and tagged the wrong entity and created confusion. And if it was a first offence, James, like you said, we'd probably be right here now laughing about it. And I'd probably admit right here that I live in fear of making this same sort of basic mistake in my reporting every day. But it's not ASX's first offence. Like, it is far from the ASX's first offence. And, you know, we are big proponents of the public markets here, James. Like, this is the exchange. It handles 80% of Australia's cash equities turnover. It's the absolute centre of our public capital markets universe. And yet some of the stuff that's going on is just embarrassing. Right. So firstly, there's the big tech overhaul, its chest replacement project, which Tony Boyd, our former colleague, was all over. You know, that's the trade clearing and settling system. It's the core infrastructure of the ASX. The whole replacement project there has been an absolute basket case, you know, going down one path, going down another, reviews, ASIC, RBA, market participants up in arms. It's a 10-year running saga now, James. Yeah. It's a shocker. Then we got the outage in December, where the settlement system failed one day just before Christmas. Trades that were supposed to settle, I mean, that means complete, right? Money changes hands. They couldn't. RBA and ASIC both said they had deep concerns with the ASX. You know, that's a scary letter to receive if you're the ASX. And then we get ASIC doing its inquiry into the ASX, finally realising that all these stuff-ups or all these mishaps add up to something more serious. And then you get this fat finger this week, James. Now, obviously, it's a very basic stuff up, right? This has got schoolboy error written all over it. The ASX called it a human error. I completely understand how a human could mix up those names.
Yeah, totally.
But it just shouldn't happen. Like, aren't there controls in place that stop such a basic thing?
Well, if there weren't before, Anthony, there certainly will be at the end of the inevitable investigation they're doing. You've got to remember that the ASX is actually a publicly listed company that trades on the ASX, and it's had a pretty tough week. It looks like its shares are going to end the week down 8 or 9%. I mean, this is just a shocker. They've had to reveal, as you said, ASIC's investigating, and ASIC is doing the right thing by the taxpayer and making the ASX pay for that investigation. It's going to cost up to $30 million, Anthony. Wow. So, you know, the ASX is under pressure from all sides. This is the time it needs to be rebuilding confidence. A fat-fingered error like this, very funny, no harm done in a way. But it further diminishes the confidence in the ASX at a time they need to be building that confidence back. So I think the CEO, Helen Lofthouse, and the chairman, David Clark, they've got a hell of a job on their hands. You know, as we always say, when you're in the middle of a problem period like this as a company, the one thing you need to do, have no more bad news. Just have a period where you're not in the news for, 5, 6 months. Try and get that out to 7 or 8 months, then get it out to 9 or 10 months. Try and go a year where you're barely in the news. These guys cannot avoid the limelight at all at the moment, and it's just hurting them really badly. So will there be more change at the top of the ASX, do you think, Anthony?
Oh, surely it'll come, James, as all these reviews lay out. But just back to the fat finger, like I was watching on the ASX on Wednesday morning as I do, and straight away picked it up.
You did.
And sent a screenshot to TBG Telecom, TBG Capital saying, haha, look at this. Look what the ASX has done. Just never, ever imagining the ASX will let the shares trade when there's this confusion in the market. And, you can make a stuff up, but then you've got 40 minutes to fix it, right? So the stuff up was made at 9:20 in the morning. The market opens at 10. You got 40 minutes to fix it and make sure those shares don't trade. If the shares didn't trade, right, and the stock didn't tank,
no problems.
I'm not sure we'd be talking about this, right? It probably wouldn't even be noticed. But the fact the shares still traded, it tanked, and then you've got all this attempted cleanup afterwards. That's what makes this one really stick in my mind.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like Detective McDonald was on the case. Maybe you need to get a job at the ASX, Anthony. That's the solution here.
James, we love great entrepreneurial stories here. And we had a cracker this week with a guy I reckon lots of people would never have heard of called Dennis Bastas, who did a deal that valued his health and beauty empire at $7 billion. I'd never heard of him, James. Who is he? And what's his secret to creating a $7 billion business?
Anthony, I'm an old rich list editor. I absolutely love this stuff. I spoke to Dennis on Tuesday. Look, he's a Melbourne bloke, son of Greek immigrants, studied industrial design and engineering at uni in Melbourne. Wanted to go and design cars, and then the 1990s recession hits. He's forced to go get a job. He gets a job at Myer in the logistics department, a 6-week contract. And all of a sudden he finds a manager who sort of explains to him how business works and how it can actually be a bit of fun and a bit creative. And he's hooked.
Wow.
So then Dennis has a series of executive roles. He worked for Village Roadshow at one stage. But eventually in about 2003 strikes out on his own and he gets into the area of generic pharmaceuticals. So these are drugs, medicines that have come off patent and you can make a cheap version. When you go to the chemist and they say, would you like the brand or would you like the generic version? He makes the generic version.
Okay.
Fast forward to 2015, he bought a big generic drug maker called Arrow Pharmaceuticals, and that's been the sort of bedrock of this empire he's built called DBG, Dennis Bastas Group. And now that includes generic pharmaceuticals, it includes some services for chemists, but its big, fast-growing business is called Vita Group, and it's a health and beauty sort of division of his empire. The big thing they bought a couple of years ago is Emco, which is another Australian-born company that makes what are politely called dupes of beauty products. So these are sort of replicas or knockoffs of the expensive stuff, an affordable way for people to get into the cosmetics that they love. So this business has been growing really well. It's gone into America and into London, into Britain, through a partnership with Target, and there's a company called Superdrug in the UK where they've managed to get this Emco stuff on the shelves as well. But Bastas is looking to expand this further, so he has gone and done a deal with a US New York merchant bank called BDT and MSD, which is a mouthful of acronyms if ever you've heard one. DBG, BDT, DDT, it's shocking. Anyway, they've done a deal. They're going to invest $1.6 billion in Bastas's company for a minority stake of about 25%. The whole thing's now worth over $7 billion. We thought it was worth, around $3 billion. And so the growth of this thing is phenomenal. The interesting part to me is the sort of, what's the secret of this business? And, he said, the secret is a lot of people said no to me. And I expected that sort of, line from entrepreneurs, it's just persistence. I get knocked down and I get, all that crap.
Yeah.
But what he meant was when people have said no to him, for example, he's gone and tried to partner with a big multinational, he's been forced to build another arm of his business. He's been forced to go out and replicate that business himself. And it's all those little businesses that he's added that have helped create this big empire. And so he's like, if I'd managed to do all these partnerships, I would have been happy, but the business would have been smaller. And P.S. Dennis Bastas wouldn't have been as rich as he's turned out to be. So It's just a really interesting story. I love the fact that we can still be surprised by the existence of a $7 billion business just sort of floating out there in the Australian economy trying to go global. I reckon it's great that you can still find these gems in different parts of the economy.
Yeah, isn't it? And something as simple and as everyday as generic drugs and then dupes makeup. Like he says, his idea in the business lessons came from his stint at Myer. This thing's now worth 7 times as much as Myer. Like, how amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And surely they've benefited from this do my makeup with me sort of trend on social media as well.
I didn't know you'd be across that, Anthony, but you're probably right, I reckon, mate. He reckons he can get a makeup product onto the shelves from the sort of coming up with the idea to getting on the shelves in 8 weeks.
That's sweet.
Obviously, makeup's a hugely fashionable, faddish business, and he's able to really move like that. So good luck. Let's see where this thing can get to. Obviously, he's got global ambitions, so it'll be really interesting to follow that story further, I reckon, Anthony.
Yeah, true.
All right, let's move to our first topic. And last Saturday morning, Victorian Premier Jacinta Allen created a storm when she announced her Labor government would move to introduce a new right for the fine citizens of Australia's best state. And that's the right to work from home 2 days a week. Now, Anthony, it took all of 5 minutes for the business community to express their collective outrage at this one. And the debate has raged all week, including or perhaps especially in the pages of the AFR.
Yeah.
Why has this one got everyone so fired up?
Where to start, James? First of all, industrial relations like this, generally a national issue, not a state-by-state system. And you'd have to question whether something like this could even get through a challenge in the High Court. No offence, James, the fact this is coming from Victoria, where the budget's in the toilet, the economy's not as strong as other parts of the country.
How dare you?
Crime's up, morale's down. This is like the tail wagging the dog. Now, work from home's great, flexibility's great. I mean, let's not confuse those two things. But, workplaces are coming up with their own policies and employees are portable. If they prefer, business with one policy over the other, they can move around based on that, right? And it's kind of up to businesses to work it out with their own employees at the moment. I think that's kind of the pact that we've landed on. It's case by case rather than a blanket rule. And I think both sides of the coin are sort of happy with that agreement. And James, this whole thing smacks of politics. And I reckon that's the thing that really gets up people's nose here.
Yeah.
Politically, sure, yes, very popular, well played on the politics, but that doesn't make it right, does it? Like giving households $1,000 a week for the rest of the year might also be very popular, but we're not doing it because it's not right. So I think that question is this just a vote buying exercise is what gets up people's nose. Like, are we saying there's genuine microeconomic reform behind this thinking, behind this policy? Remember, we're having this giant productivity debate at the moment, James. And how do you think Victoria's out of the blue work from home policy fits into that debate? The way it jars, I think that's why it's got up people's nose.
Yeah.
James, we've been having this debate for 5 years now, right? This work from home debate. It came out of the pandemic. And we actually had some data on work from home this week. Something that's been missing in this debate so far. What did the data tell us?
NAB puts out this wellness survey. They've got an argument that economy that feels healthy and happy is a better economy. Mm-hmm. You can sort of see the logic there. And they've actually been tracking work from home trends. What they track is what the amount people are actually working from home, what they expect to be working from home in the next 12 months, and what they'd like to be working from home. Now, to your point about popularity, what they'd like to be working from home, they'd like to be working 48% of the time from home. So, okay, Jacinta Allen, tick on the politics. Where they're actually working from home at the moment, it's 30%. And they expect that to rise to 36% in the next 12 months. So this speaks, Anthony, to what you're saying, that the market's actually found a pretty good solution. And I actually don't think everyone's happy with it. I think people are sort of equally unhappy with it. The market's found that about 30% is the right level, which is actually what the Victorian government is saying it should be anyway, 2 days a week.
Yep.
But it just says, why do we need to mandate it? The market's worked this out. The market needs to be flexible because every business is different. Just stick your nose out of it. This is not an area where the government needs to get involved. I think it's very telling, Anthony, that every other state, wall-to-wall Labor premiers, every other state has walked away and said, nah, not for us. I mean, as you say, Victoria, just every time we can go a little bit worse than everyone else, we seem to manage to do that.
What's interesting here, like there's a wider backdrop as well. This is not just an Australian issue. In the US, we've got a bit of a return to office push. We've got job cuts, we've got AI. Is the tone there a bit different?
I think the tone is shifting so fast.
Yeah.
Remember 2 or 3 years ago in the middle of the pandemic and CEOs were all about, our people are our greatest assets.
Yeah.
Now the labour market's loosening up, the economy's slowing, AI's coming. The change in tone, especially in America, is incredible.
Yeah.
There was a memo this week sent out by a guy called John Stankey. And probably haven't heard of him, but he's the CEO of AT&T, which is the US equivalent of Telstra, right? Mm-hmm. So he sends a memo to responding to a staff survey. Now, January, Stanky comes out and he says, right, we're coming back to the office. And he doesn't go with the sort of CBA, ANZ, come back 2 days a week, please. He says 5 days a week in the office or else.
Wow.
And so he does the staff survey. Guess what? The staff survey doesn't come back that happy with the move. And Stanky this week has just doubled down. He says, if you think you need a hybrid or a work from home arrangement, there's heaps of other places to work. Go work there. And honestly, the language is not that different to what I'm saying. But then he goes a step further and he says, I'm going to quote here because I think it's interesting. I understand that some of you may have started your tour with this company expecting a, quote, employment deal rooted in loyalty, tenure, and conformance with associated compensation, work structure, and benefits. We have consciously shifted away from some of these elements towards a more market-based culture, focusing on rewarding capability, contribution, and commitment.
Oof, that's scary language.
So he's basically saying, how we used to call you part of the family.
Yeah.
Now you are a unit of labour and you will act like this. Now, this is an extreme, right, Anthony? I don't think we're going to see Australian CEOs talking like this. The political climate here is very different. We've got a propensity of hauling any CEO who steps out of line in front of a parliamentary inquiry. I think it's different. But I guess I would say as the economy slows, we could see a change in tone and a change in approach from Australian companies that'll make this work from home debate seem pretty silly in a couple of years. I don't know. Do you think Australian CEOs will follow the lead and start talking tough?
Well, first, can I just say, I can only imagine the headlines around that story, James, with a surname like Stanky and a memo like that. But I think Australia's a very different place, James. Yeah. The US, it's wired differently, right? Wired differently, sort of socially, politically, culturally, and it's even more different now that the people have voted in Donald Trump and the Conservatives in charge. Remember, Trump's no work from home fan. Remember when he came in on January 20?
Yes.
One of the first things he did was the return to the office policy. It was return to in-person work directive from the White House. It was all about getting people back in the office. And I think the message from the top in the US is very different. And that's what sort of sets the tone. And that's emboldens business and business leaders to use this sort of language with their own employees. I can't imagine any Australian CEOs, well, the big blue chip companies that we speak to, using that sort of language in a memo.
All right, but maybe they don't change their language. But could we see a shift towards more cost cutting? More, hollowing out of the workforce as the economy slows. Maybe they're not out there shouting it from the rooftops like Mr. Stanky, but could we see that shift?
Oh, definitely. At the end of the day, there's big changes that are happening in business, in society, and AI, all that stuff, productivity. Business is under massive pressure to cut costs as well from shareholders. That's part of life. And I think from my conversation with CEOs, James, and I'd be interested in getting your perspectives on this, I think they prefer staff in the office as much as possible, right? I mean, that's just the fact. Yes, they understand about flexible working and people's commitments in work hours, but that's different to a right to work from home. They see that they pay a lot of rent for a big premises, so they'd like to see it full. They like to see their troops in front of them when they walk into their office and need someone to direct around. I mean, they like the fact that they grew up through the ranks when you could come into the office and learn from the older people, and they'd like the younger people today to get that experience as well. So I think very much we're still skewed around the office culture and people being in the office. I just think it's funny, James, we're 5 years on from COVID. This is a story that still gets the blood pumping, that we're still getting these sort of fractures on and these big developments in. And it's so much more than just a business issue, isn't it? Like, it's a social issue.
Yeah, totally.
Jacinta Allen shows us it's a political one as well.
I think we'll be talking about this for a lot longer to come.
100%. And James, just quickly, while we're in the US, big news as we record the podcast on Friday morning, Donald Trump has named Stephen Mirren as a temporary Fed governor. Now, firstly, who's Stephen Mirren? And secondly, what's a temporary Fed governor?
Well, Stephen Mirren is maybe Trump's top acolyte. He's the White House chief economic advisor. Basically, when Trump says tariffs are cool and rates need to come down, Moran goes out and says tariffs are really cool and rates really need to come down.
Okay.
Look, he's an economist. He's written some really interesting papers about rewiring the economic system. Very controversial. Ironically, Anthony, last year he wrote a paper about reforming the Federal Reserve, which is the US version of the RBA. And in that he said that he didn't think people should go from the political side of the fence to the Fed because they might show their biases. And guess what Mr. Moran's just done? He's gone from the White House straight to the Fed. Now, he's there only for 5 months because there's a vacancy that runs until January 26 on the Fed. So he's a bit of a stopgap measure, and Trump said that. But look, the political pressure on the Fed to cut rates is huge, and now Trump's got a man inside there, albeit for 5 months and albeit for his one vote on the board. But it's a pretty extraordinary moment. It just says to investors that interest rates are only going one way. So watch this space.
Got it. So he's a bit like one of MCO's dupes. He's the same as Trump. He just doesn't cost as much.
Yes. Very nicely done, Anthony. Very nicely done.
All right, James, for our second topic, let's look at one of the country's most active investment funds. It's your National Reconstruction Fund. The NRF was set up by the government last year to invest up to $15 billion to diversify and transform Australia's industry and economy. It's been cutting checks to biotechs, rare earths hopefuls, tech companies, all sorts of other stuff, all in the name of doing good for Australia. James, it shot to prominence this week. First, it was slated to a stake in Australia's troubled aluminium smelters, which are huge electricity-intensive industrial sites around the country. And then on Thursday, it cut a $50 million cheque for WA lithium miner Liontown Resources. James, congratulations on your investments. Thanks for propping up the country. What's actually going on here? And is it a good or bad thing that we have the NRF running around like this, investing money on our behalf?
Thank you. I'm pleased to be investing alongside you in this stuff.
Yeah.
This is a really interesting one. You can get the idea behind the National Reconstruction Fund. Like, it's supposed to help all these really heavy manufacturing businesses like smelters, like the Whyalla Steelworks, try and transform themselves for the modern economy and the modern decarbonised economy. I can sort of get that. But as you said, it's getting into some really interesting areas now as our sort of national policy agenda opens up. So the Labor government's put a sort of stake in the ground and says, we want to make sure that we've got our foot on good supply of critical minerals and rare earths, like stuff like lithium and cobalt and all that sort of gear. And so now we've got the NRF investing $50 million in the equity of a company called Liontown Resources. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? In one way, you could say, well, Liontown Resources is going to be, should be, hopefully will be, could be a big part of the critical minerals industry in this country. It's going through a little tough patch. Let's get it through that. And so, in a decade's time, this business is a much bigger business that can support lots of jobs and help us reach our sort of national goals. But it's a punt, isn't it, Anthony?
100%.
And it's a punt with real money. And it's a punt with your money and my mum's money and your uncle's money and everyone's money. So I think we've really got to watch this closely because, Anthony, there's like a whole bag of distressed, crappy assets that the fund's been linked to. Everything from, as I said, the Whyalla Steelworks, the Mount Isa copper smelter, the Tomago aluminium smelter, which is owned by Rio Tinto in New South Wales. Like, how does the NRF decide what it's going to invest in?
We're only really learning about it, James. This is new territory, and for all the reasons you've just explained. I mean, it's good to see David Hall, a former NAB executive who now runs the NRF. It's good to see him on the front foot with an interview in the paper post this Liontown deal this week.
Yeah.
I love it when these people come out and try to explain what they're up to. I think it's so important because There are huge question marks over it, but there's no point shying away from those. It's good to see he's out on the front foot and trying to explain it. I went back a step. The NRF's new. I've not known much about it, so I went and looked up the corporate plan. So yeah, the purpose is to be Australia's sovereign investor in manufacturing capability and facilitate capital flows in areas of the Australian economy. I mean, part of that, James, is obviously backstopping things that other people aren't willing to fund. And part of that's trying to fund the next batch of things that could be significant players in the economy, the future industries. It's targeting 7 areas. The biggest one is renewables and low emissions technology, right? And up to $3 billion is slated to be invested there. I mean, the other ones are a lot of the things that you hear pop up in the zeitgeist, like defense, value-add resources, value-add things that could help in the ag sector, things that could help in manufacturing. But it's moving so quickly, James. This is a new player on the street with a big mandate, and it's spraying checks around. It can invest across the capital structure. It can be debt, it can be equity, and it invites submissions for investment, James. And it'd be interesting to hear how many submissions it received, because you'd think there'd be hundreds of capital-constrained businesses out there who would like a bit of sticky government money. My concern with these funds, James, they sound good in theory, but, A, does the government have the investment expertise? And B, what happens if the politics change and we want to shut it down?
Yeah.
How do you unwind a portfolio of little things? It's really hard to do, and it's building a portfolio that's incredibly unique, and I'm not sure anyone else would own in their entirety, and it's doing it for strategic reasons. But James, let's head back to Liontown Resources. You wrote about it this week. Like, Liontown was flying a couple of years ago. This US company was trying to buy it for $6.6 billion. It was the toast of the town. Gina Reinhardt bought in. Why does it even need the government to bail it out?
Well, the lithium price is in the toilet, Anthony. Actually, it's not in the toilet. It's in the S-bend of the toilet, below the toilet. At its peak, the lithium price was $6,400 a tonne for carbonate. That's in US dollars. In May this year, it got down to $600. That's a big difference, obviously.
Isn't it?
So lots of projects that looked absolutely brilliant at $6,400 a tonne now don't look so good at $600 or $700 a tonne. Look, Liontown's done a great job of cutting its cloth to suit the times. It's scaled back its project. It's managed to get debt and equity packages. The CEO there, Tony Ottaviano, he's done a great job of keeping investors interested, getting the government interested. But to your point, the government's investment in this business now changes its cost of capital. Everybody, all the other investors, they look at this and say, well, the government's brought in $50 million. If Liontown struggles again, the government's going to want to protect that investment. They'll put some more money in. And so that props up the Liontown share price higher than it might otherwise be, and it changes the cost of capital. Now, that's a distortion. There's just no way around it. I mean, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? We're not going to know for a decade, Anthony. Maybe Liontown shares are down 70% in the last 2 years. Maybe they're going to go up 70% in the next 2 years. The NRF's going to look like superstars, but you just don't know. And in some ways, that's not the point of why they're trying to do this. Anthony, the checkbook's clearly open. What else would you like to see them invest in? Well, I've got an up-and-coming podcast they could support. You got any other ideas?
It's a good question, James. It's so easy to sit here and take pot shots and just, say everything's bad. As a general rule, though, I'd prefer to see big bets, not small. It's surely you're better off really picking some winners, some concentrated ones. Also, as a general rule, I think when needed, sometimes we have to let businesses fail. There's this huge push against that at the moment, government bailing stuff out. We see from the States that investing in infrastructure works, right? You can get there, you can start the infrastructure project, get it up and running, and then sell it off to the super system if you want to, right? And really get that recycling of capital through the economy, and that's good for the economy. It's good for productivity. I just can't help but feel like business is best in the hands of business people. A proper business needs a proper cost of capital, to your point. Think about, you need your Andrew Forrests, right? And who runs Fortescue. Man, as mad as they can be. He came in, he set this up, funded it, financed. It was really hard yards for him, right? 15 years ago, 20 years ago to get it off the ground. There was no NRF helping him out back then. He had to scramble to banks in Australia, the US, hedge funds, equity, Chinese steel mills, customers, all this sort of stuff. Now, you go through a really, really hard period. You have a business with a proper cost of capital. You manage to get that capital up, and out the other side of it, you get this giant cash machine, right? That's withstood a lot of tests. I just wonder whether we're trying to take that part out of the equation a little bit, and whether businesses that emerge from the other side of a government handout like this have really been through that same rigor.
At the very least, your point about David Gall fronting up and answering questions as CEO of the NRF, and I think if he can keep doing that, and whoever from the NRF can keep explaining what they're trying to do, all the due diligence they've done, that transparency will give taxpayers a bit of reassurance. So that is really good to see. This is a bit of a grand experiment, but it's a grand experiment that's happening all over the world.
Yeah.
We're seeing Trump pump money into different companies, lots of rules around supply of critical minerals in America and other places. Of course, the Chinese completely control their private sector as well. So in some ways, you've got to play the game. Let's make sure, I guess, we play it in the best way possible, Anthony.
Well said.
All right, we'll be back after the break. It's here. Rate day. What will the RBA do? Back in a sec. All right, welcome back. If you want to know more about what we're talking about today and a whole lot more, AFR subscribers can sign up to the Chanticleer newsletter at join.afr.com/Chanticleer. Every Saturday morning, the newsletter pulls together the best Chanticleer columns from the week and delivers them straight to your inbox. All right, Anthony, Tuesday, RBA. Will they or won't they cut rates?
I don't think they can surprise the market twice in 2 months, can they, James?
I don't think so. Here's my follow-up, Anthony. How many more rate cuts before the end of the year?
1.
I agree.
I mean 1 in total, no more.
So there's just this week and then none?
Yeah, 1 cut.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I'm 2. I think they'll cut in September and probably November.
Uh-huh.
I think that has become the most interesting debate. Are we 2 or 3? Spoke to Owen Wilson, the outgoing CEO of REA Group, which owns realestate.com. He's seeing a hell of a lot of demand for property at the moment. He's in the 2 rate cut camp, which I just think is interesting. Economists are divided. Let's hope we get some more clues from Michelle Bullock this week. Tuesday night, we get US inflation figures, which the Fed and Stephen Moran will be following closely. No doubt Donald Trump will have something to say. And Anthony, we're really getting into the excitement of reporting season next week. On Tuesday, we've got 7 Group, SGH, and Treasury Wines. On Thursday, we've got Suncorp, but on Wednesday, the big one, CBA.
Yeah, great timing to be right after the RBA. Matt Coleman will get some questions on interest rates. But yeah, huge week of results. It's best time of the year. Can't wait for the next 3 weeks.
Excellent. All right, we love questions here on the Chanticleer podcast. This week, our questions from Amaric. And if you've got a question you want to send in, you can email us at chanticleer@afr.com. You can use the widget on all Chanticleer articles at afr.com. And you can also send us a question in audio form. Just record a voice memo on your phone, include your name and where you're from, and email it to us. And that's exactly what Amaric's done.
Hi, James and Anthony. Thanks for the podcast. Really love your tone, your incisiveness, and your pinch of humor. Wouldn't it be beneficial for everyone to introduce 2 GST rates, one rate for products of necessity and another rate for other types of good? As part of this reform, you would lower the first rate, thus relieving cost of living pressure for the most modest, whilst increasing the second rate to effectively raise more tax. More tax raised, a more progressive system, and the government could still claim benefits for the less rich. Isn't it a win-win solution?
Really interesting suggestion, Anthony. And my first thought was, how confusing would this be? Mm-hmm. But then you think about the current construction of the GST, that famous example of the if you go to the shops and you buy a birthday cake that's already made, you're paying GST. If you buy the ingredients, you're not paying GST, or something like that. I've probably got the details a little mixed, but you get the point. We've done so many exclusions and exemptions that we've got a pretty weird system already, don't we?
We do. Great question, Amaric. You've won yourself a ticket to the Economic Roundtable. Yeah, we do have 2 tiers now. So right now, 10%. Flat on most goods and services, but then there's a big bucket of exceptions, James, and you try and get your head around the exceptions, and it's like some of this, some of that, some of this, some of that. It's really, really vague. and quite complex. It's a ragtag list of exceptions. And I think that's the hard part with the two-tier systems, James.
Yeah.
And that's the hard part with what we've got now, and it's the hard part of what Americ's talking about. In theory, yeah, like 100%. Let's, tax consumption more on, discretionary goods and less on non-discretionary goods. It makes sense. You can raise more tax, help out the people that need it the most, all that sort of stuff. But I think this would just be increasing complexity into a tax system at the time when let's try and reduce complexity first. If we are trying to make wholesale changes, let's try and simplify even more.
Yeah, we have had some interesting ideas around the GST. Kate Cheney had an idea around a more progressive GST approach this week. So I think this question's in the right ballpark. There are people thinking about it. And you wrote this week, Anthony, that we're in this really weird period around the economic roundtable where suddenly like anything seems possible.
Yeah.
Any idea is worth debating, and maybe something like this could work. I'm just getting the vibes in the last couple of days, Anthony, that Albanese's given Jim Chalmers a fair bit of rope with this economic roundtable, and now he's just tightening that rope, just reeling it in a bit and saying, we're probably not going to have any major changes to economic policy here. I'm loving all the idea generation. I just hope it doesn't end with nothing. That's my fear.
Yeah, it's a danger.
All right, Anthony. Well, it's going to be a big week next week. RBA, CBA, all the BA and all the BS will be back next Friday to discuss. It's going to be quite the week.
See you next week, James.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you like the podcast and you want to hear more, consider sharing or giving the podcast a review, as it helps other listeners find us. And don't forget to follow wherever you get your podcasts. At The Financial Review, we investigate the big stories about markets, business and power. For more, go to afr.com, and you can subscribe to The Financial Review, the daily habit of successful people, at afr.com/subscribe. Chanticleer was hosted by me, James Thompson, and Anthony McDonald, and was produced by Alex Gow and Mandy Coolin. Our theme is by Alex Gow. Head of Premium Content is Fiona Buffini.
The Australian Financial Review.